Good morning for those of you who are chiming in from the United States, and good evening for those of you who are chiming in from Asia. Welcome to Stimson CIGS seminar on the current Ukraine crisis and its impact on Japanese foreign policy. I'm still letting everybody in, so we will get started in the next few minutes. We'll get, again, for those of you who just joined, welcome. We're still letting a few more people in. So we'll get started in the next few minutes. Yeah, there's two people coming in. Okay, I think we may be waiting for a few more people, but we're just going to go ahead and get started because we only have an hour. Good morning for those of you who are joining us from the United States. Good evening for those of you who are joining us from the in Japan, in Asia, and good afternoon if some of you are joining us from Europe. Welcome to Stimson CIGS seminar on Ukraine crisis on Japanese foreign its impact on Japanese foreign policy. Stimson's Japan program has been pleased to collaborate with the Canon Institute for Global Studies headquartered in Tokyo, and we host this semi-regular joint seminar on the issues that are relevant to Japanese foreign policy and U.S.-Japan relations. And today I am delighted to have three wonderful speakers to share their thoughts on the current Ukraine crisis and how it's impacting Japan's foreign policy, Japan's relationship with Europe, and from the United States perspective, what does this all mean for U.S. alliance management worldwide? From Washington, D.C., I have Dr. Zach Cooper, who's a senior fellow at American Enterprise Institute. And joining us from Tokyo is Mr. Kuni Miyake, who I refer to always as my boss in Tokyo, who's a research director at the Canon Institute for Global Studies. And from Europe, I'm very, very delighted to have Ms. Céline Pajon, research fellow and head of Japan research at the Center for Asian Center at the French Institute of International Relations, but she also dual hats herself as the International Research Fellow at CIGS. So welcome, everybody. Looking forward to our discussion today for the next hour. So let me start from Kuni. I know you've been on the Japanese media a lot, and Japan's response to current Ukraine crisis, especially some of them very, very close-knit in lockstep with the US and the European partners on the sanctions vis-a-vis Russia and how that's impacting on Japan's foreign policy toward Russia moving forward. All those things have been discussed and a whole host of issues. So how's this crisis impacting the debate in Japan in terms of what this means for Japan moving forward?
Well, I thank you, Yuki, and thank you, Zach and Céline, for joining us. It's great to have you all. I cannot tell you anything on behalf of the Japanese government, although I'm advising somebody. But my conclusion is very simple. Tokyo is probably awakening now, well, but not as awoke as Germany is, maybe. But we are in the process of awakening because as far as the Japan-Russia relations are concerned, I think Prime Minister Kishida made a very tough decision, very difficult decision, but significant sort of a departure from the previous position. So I like to take advantage of the next 5 minutes to share with you how I see those latest developments in grain, Europe, and the rest of the world. First of all, I do not think that this, what shall I say, war in Ukraine is a cause, beginning of something. I think this is a result of the tripartite U.S., Russia, China rivalry at the global level. So remember, last August, we witnessed the fall of Kabul, and then the war took place, erupted in Ukraine. I think this is not the end. I think this new round of what I call the era of the decision, erroneous decision by intuition or coincidence or misjudgment will continue, at least for a while, like we experienced in the 1930s. So I think as many European or American pundits have already predicted, the world is going to be more complicated, difficult place to live in. But I don't think that the current situation, what's going on in this on the earth, is not as simple as just a democracy versus authoritarian division of the globe. I don't think it's that simple. I think this is much more complicated than that. And I'm afraid to say that probably this is the beginning of the former empires, traditional empires, the rivalry among the 3 or 4 former empires, including Russia, China, Turkey, and maybe Iran. Those actors will be back to the stage, and they will compete with each other. Unfortunately, all of them believe that this is the challenge of the post-Cold War international order. Everybody has a different dream, but I think they all share that they have to challenge those international orders. And in a sense, this is a nationalism. So I'm afraid to say that it is going to continue, at least for a while. Then what's going to happen to Japan? Well, I think what is happening in Germany is very intriguing. Could be a good sign, a good example for us, because as I said, we are awakening, if not as awoke as Germany is, but I think Japan realizes that something else should be done to cope with the new situation in our part of the world, in the Pacific region, because Germany has only one adversary. That could be the Russian Federation. But for us, in this part of the world, we have China and Russia at the same time, and they are neighbors. They could work together. So I'm afraid to say that Japan, it's high time for Japan to learn at least 5 lessons from the war in Ukraine. Although it is premature to say this, but I just wrote about it in Sankei newspaper. So I give you 5 lessons Japan should learn in the next decade or 2. Number 1, what we learned from Ukraine is that we cannot count on the experts' prediction it's not always right. So you have to be that dubious. You cannot trust them at the beginning. That's number one. Number two, what I learned from Ukraine is that if you don't have a means to fight, you cannot defend your country. It's as simple as that. And number three, if you don't have intelligence, you cannot win. And that's exactly what Ukraine is getting from NATO countries. Do we have enough good external intelligence service organization? No, we don't. And then number four, we cannot defend our country without an alliance system. And Ukraine has no ally. Ukraine is a non-NATO member, so that's why no NATO countries have the obligation to defend Ukraine. So we are luckier because we have alliance with the United States and maybe semi-alliances with other countries in the foreseeable future. But having said that, finally, and the last last lesson I have to learn, or the Japanese people have to learn from Ukraine, is that allies will not help you if you don't fight first. Remember, as I said earlier, in Kabul, the president of Afghanistan fled the country, while the president of Ukraine continued to stay in Kyiv and fought. And that's the biggest difference between Kabul and Kyiv. So I think the lesson is extremely important and clear that we should be ready to fight, to defend our countries before we ask for help from allied nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kuni. It's always interesting to hear your thoughts. And thank you for those 5 lessons. That's, I think, a very good place for us to start discussion when we move into a Q&A session. But Celine, so listening to you, you focus on Japan from a European perspective, and clearly Japan's response to this Ukraine crisis really started to open a new pathways for how Japan and EU cooperates, or Japan NATO cooperates. So how do you see that moving forward from sitting where you are?
Well, remember, oh, excuse me, go ahead.
It's Celine's turn.
No, I mute.
Okay, sorry, Kuni-san. Okay, thank you very much, Yuki, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Before I start, I would just like to pay a tribute to the Ukrainian civilians who are enduring really horrific event and aggressions right now. So we are discussing the implication of the war in Ukraine, but it's really terrible what's going on. So just to keep that in mind. So now we try to respond to your questions. Yeah, actually during this episode, this crisis, I think we've seen the reactions of 2 players that went beyond their expectation, which is the reaction of the EU and the reaction of Japan. And I think in a way we can try to find similarities and compare between the 2 situations. And as I will explain, and as you said, it's actually opening the path for more cooperation, I believe, between the 2 international players. So as you know, the EU and Japan are traditionally quite cautious players on the international scene. They take some time to react, to position themselves on complicated issues, especially when it comes to, taking side in a kind of armed conflict situation or crisis situation. It's quite complicated. The EU has published its first global strategy only in 2016, so it's still learning to become a geopolitical player. And as you know, Japan has its own constraint too, vis-a-vis the US, and on how to use its military on the international scene. And I believe the EU has also this kind of issue. Both the EU and Japan have complicated relations with Russia. They are both neighbors to Russia in a way, so they need to keep at some point some channel of communications. They cannot afford to keep completely blackouts from Moscow. So at some point we can see similarities between Macron's attempt to reintegrate Russia back in the G7 at some point, and the Abe's engagement policy vis-à-vis Putin. And we remember that after the Crimea annexion, Japan took only very symbolic sanctions. So at that time, it really stood out as having really a unique stance on Russia and almost marginalized itself within the G7. But what we can see this time is completely different. As you've seen, we've seen very swift reactions from both the EU and Japan. Actually, the Europeans were quite much maybe more proactive than the US at some point to take a very resolute measure. It took really groundbreaking decisions, decide to buy some military equipment to provide to the Ukrainians, and tough sanctions too vis-à-vis Russia. As you know, Germany broke some historical or political taboo regarding its defense posture and military expenditures. And I believe the Europeans really, and the EU really transforming itself into a credible geopolitical player and security provider. So at some point it resonates with Japan. So we've seen, as Miyake-san explained, that Tokyo really broke with the Abe engagement approach, adopting sanctions and showing also solidarity with the EU through providing some LNG shipments, which is a quite important decisions, and also strong alignment with the US and G7, and adopting a kind of rhetoric that it's traditionally used in Japan to describe the Chinese moves in the East and South China Sea. So there is clearly a reassessment, a very strong reassessment of what is Russia now, what Russia is doing, and what are going to be the relation between Japan and Russia. Yeah, I think so. The latest development provide really a new, an additional basis to develop the bilateral cooperation. First, now Japan and the EU share more enhanced security capacity or enhanced willingness to act in case of a crisis. So Japan's reaction has been seen very positively in Europe, of course. It's opening possible areas of cooperation in case of international crisis. We can imagine, Tokyo and Brussels coordinating at some point economic and political sanctions, trying to coordinate security support or logistical supports to countries who are attacked. Provide some kind of cyber security measures, also space cooperations. And as Miyake-san referred to, I believe the intelligence information sharing is really key here. I believe Ukraine turned to Japan to ask for some, to share some information from its satellite to try to geographically locate the Russian forces. So it can be interesting to try to think about a kind of framework to share, safely share some kind of sensitive information in case of a conflict or a crisis somewhere in the world. Also, both the EU and Japan is now reassessing its relation with Russia, and Japan's breaking with its previous position, I think, bring back Tokyo much closer to the European positions vis-à-vis Moscow. Both the EU and Japan has to try to secure their premises and seek also maybe at some point some security reassurance from Russia, but this will be discussed later on, of course. There is also reconsideration of the China-Russia partnerships and of its implication both for the EU and Japan. There is really a realization in Europe about the depth of the China-Russia rapprochement, both in terms of its impact and its revisionist stance on the international systems and governance, but also about the very concrete defense cooperation between the two countries. So I believe the European may be more sympathetic vis-à-vis Japan regarding Tokyo's challenges by Russia regarding its territorial dispute, but also the violation of Japan's aerial and territorial space. And maybe will lead to more linkage between the European and Asian theaters, at least in the discussion between experts and official, and maybe at a NATO level. As you know, NATO it is not brand new, but NATO is dedicating more energy and attentions to look at what China is doing. Also, so that may be a trend that will continue in the future. What we've seen also is an acceleration of the coalition of democracy in a way, even if things might be more complicated than two blocks, emergence of two blocks. Well, that's quite important. I think value-based foreign policy will become more important in the future, and it will impact all dimensions, including the business sectors, the question of having some ethic, global value chains, and so on, economic security and resilience. Will be very important. The question of how to show solidarity between like-minded countries. And finally, the reform of UN and the UN Security Council that is both supported by and advocated by the Europeans and Japan. So all of this is really providing a very strong, I believe, ground, very fertile ground for, better and more extensive cooperation in the future. But here I would like to end maybe with a bit more nuanced remarks, because the current war in Ukraine could also raise some potential irritants or frictions between the EU and Japan. First, on energy and raw material sourcing, because Japan and Europeans are likely to be more in competition to secure sustainable sources of gas and oil. So how to avoid that, how to prevent some such friction, to work together at some point. And another point is the competition for the US attention and engagement. I think it will continue in the future, especially if China is moving ahead with Taiwan, is trying to team up with Russia to challenge Japan on different fronts. And there is also the question of the issue of North Korea. It might not be a top priority for the Biden administration right now, but still it's Japan's next door neighbor, and it's now asking for more attention, it seems, because it's still making progress in its nuclear program. So I guess it's going to be a concern, ongoing concern for Tokyo. So maybe we will see this kind of competition for attention of the US and competition for access to sustainable sources of energy in the future. But except for this, I see a lot of ways that Europe and Japan can reinforce their cooperation.
Thank you for that thought. Very nuanced, very interesting to hear from how this is all looking from the Europe, really. And last but not least, Zach, this current crisis in Ukraine really threw a monkey wrenches into, I guess, Biden administration's foreign policy agenda, and especially at the heel of national security strategy was about to come out, defense strategy was about to come out. They just already came out earlier last month with its Indo-Pacific strategy, and now this. So how do you see this affects Biden administration's foreign policy agenda moving forward?
So first, let me just say it's wonderful to be alongside all of you, and I really have appreciated the comments that Kunmi and Celine have already made, and Yuki, looking forward to hearing more of your views as well. So I think the Biden administration has handled the Ukraine crisis quite well, much better than most people would have expected given the challenges it had with Afghanistan. And I think it has done an incredible job of keeping NATO together, keeping the US lashed up with Europe, but also, of course, with key Asian allies and partners, in particular, Japan, Korea, Australia, Singapore. And that's been very important. And so I think what we've seen from my point of view is an administration deal very ably with this crisis, which is not to say that, of course, things in Ukraine are going the way we want. I think Ukraine, as Celine was saying, has just been incredibly impressive in its ability to fight back against Russia. But obviously the horrors we're seeing there are just terrible. But from the administration's perspective, I think their top two goals were to try and put real costs economically on Russia for this invasion, and second, to keep the alliance, the NATO alliance, together. And I think they've done that. The question now, as you asked, is sort of where do we go from here and how does this affect Japan? And I'll just build on what Kuni was saying at the beginning, which is I think many people are going to ask a question, which is this sort of going to be a Germany moment for Japan, right? Are we going to see Japan go to 2% of GDP spending on defense? Are we going to see other kinds of efforts? And I'll say, I know we're seeing some of that discussion. I think it's actually a little bit of a mistake to focus on defense spending numbers, which is not to say that more defense spending wouldn't be good, it would. But the real question is, how are we as an alliance in the US and Japan working together to deter what happened in Ukraine in the similar situation that Japan has, which would be Taiwan, right? A non-treaty ally whose security is directly interlinked with that of the United States and Japan, and who's increasingly under pressure from an authoritarian actor. And in my view, yes, more defense spending from the United States, from Taiwan, if it were spent correctly, could help. But the real question is, do we have the alliance set up in the way we need to defend not just the US and Japan, but to also deter potential contingencies across the Taiwan Strait? And I'm not sure that we do. And I hope that this is a bit of a wake-up call, not just for Tokyo, but for Washington as well. Think about the US alliances, the major US alliances. So I'll put three on the table for now: NATO, Korea, Australia. So if you look at all three of those alliances, they have some fundamental differences from the US-Japan alliance, and there are good historical reasons for this. But take Korea, right? There is a combined operational command in Korea that would take control in wartime, right? So the two countries come together, a very combined command. In Australia, you have combined capability development increasingly through the AUKUS arrangement, right? Where we don't focus on what we're going to do together today necessarily in that arrangement, but it's about what we're doing in the next decade or 2 decades in terms of defense capabilities. And in NATO, we have both. We have Allied Command Operations and Allied Command Transformation. So both the combined operations and the combined capability development. When you look at the US-Japan alliance, we have none of that. There are good historical reasons that we don't have a combined command. There are good historical reasons that we haven't done as much combined capability development as I think we should. But when I look at the US-Japan alliance, and I think, what would we have to do today to deter the kind of contingency around Taiwan that we are worried about and that Ukraine should really bring forefront in our minds? The first answer for me isn't defense spending. That may be part of it. The first answer is making sure that we can operate very effectively together in operations and in combined operations. And I don't think we have the structures that we need to do that yet. And then the second question is, are we doing everything on the combined capability development side that we need to be doing? And there, I think clearly, again, the answer is no. right? Both of our countries are going in different directions on developing future fighter jets. We don't have a combined effort to build anti-ship cruise missiles, which would be an obvious area of cooperation. And so I think for the US and Japan, what Ukraine should remind us of is that when these crises arise, you don't have a lot of time to respond, right? You sort of, you go into that situation with what you have already, not what you can build quickly. And at the moment, the lack of a combined operational command and the lack of combined capability development, I think is going to make it very difficult for the alliance to respond as forcefully as we would want. And so I think what the Ukraine crisis should do is remind us that we actually need to move forward in some of these areas and that we don't have a lot of time and there should be much more urgency. So I don't want to take anything away from the excellent cooperation we've seen between the US and Japan on Ukraine and on Russia. I will join, I think, probably all Americans in really applauding what Tokyo has done, taking a very active leadership role in this effort. But I think it has to remind us that the mission that we have to secure the alliance and to deter crisis in the region, that requires us to do more than we're doing today and to really accelerate our efforts to deepen the alliance. Thanks.
Thank you, Zach. Usually I would go around the second round of questions, but questions from the audience are pouring in already. So I'm just going to get right to their questions. So one of the most obvious question that many of these people have been asking is, because of this Japan's much firmer stance vis-a-vis Russia in terms of joining the US and the rest of Europe, NATO allies and EU partners on economic sanctions. Obviously, many people are curious about what does this mean for Japan-Russia relations moving forward, and then especially in the event in the context of how Germany reacted on the Nord Stream 2. These questions also revolves around the Sakhalin LNG developments. So this is, I guess, more like a Kuni question, that where do you see, how will Sakhalin LNG play the same role in Japan as Nord Stream 2 played in Germany's calculation? And how has this changed the position on the how Japan should be facing Russia in terms of Northern Territory negotiations and ultimately peace treaty negotiations? So my first question is to you, Kuni, and then we'll go through other questions as the time allows.
Prime Minister Shinzo Abe met Putin for 26 or 7 times, and it was a good try. And but at the same time, despite his efforts to convince Putin wasn't convinced. He didn't make a strategic decision, just like he didn't just 4 or 5 weeks ago. Putin is not ready to accept that China could be ultimate adversary for Russia in the long run. And Putin has been still focused on the European theater, and especially the confrontation with the United States. Therefore, Putin didn't positively respond to the offer from Shinzo. Prime Minister Suga, following Shinzo, didn't do much to Russia-Japan relations, but given the crisis in Ukraine, Mr. Kishida's decision is crystal clear. It's not a total departure from the previous sorts of the past. He might have put the Japan-Russia relations on hold, at least for a while. And Sakhalin 1, Sakhalin 2, it will be a matter of time, but we cannot give it up now. I don't think that we will hold. Probably we might freeze it for a while. But I would say Sakhalin 1 and 2 is, as compared to the Nord Stream 2, it's small, but still we need some. But we cannot continue it as usual, business as usual. So probably we will not do a lot with respect to those natural gas projects in Sakhalin. That's my view.
Thank you, Kuni. So let me hop around this topic a little bit. Building on Zach's comment on the how Biden administration has responded to this crisis so far, putting the allied coalition together, intense diplomatic efforts going in, but then also one could argue that he has made his administration did make a decision that the U.S. would not commit its military forces with the non-treaty allies, especially when the aggressor is a nuclear weapon state. So that you could also argue that decision has limited the support that the U.S. has been willing to provide to the Ukraine to this date, like we have been hearing about, transfer or non of MiG-29s from Poland, long range drones, and et cetera. So in that transplant that in Asia for a moment, how can China be deterred from undertaking conventional military conflict against no nuclear state or entity? So I would throw that out to you, Zach, first, and then I would invite Celine and Kuni for further comments.
Yeah, Yuki, I think this is a great question, and one of the toughest ones for the Biden team to think about. Interestingly, they clearly had been worried about this dynamic as early as December. So Jake Sullivan gave remarks to the Council on Foreign Relations in mid-December, in which he very clearly said that Ukraine and Taiwan were different. And the reason they were different, he said, is because there's no Ukraine Relations Act, right? Referring to the Taiwan Relations Act, which, is not a full treaty commitment from the US to Taiwan, but is something different than what exists with Ukraine. So clearly the Biden team is trying to say, well, yes, Taiwan may not be a treaty ally, but it's something more than just a pure partner, I would think is how they would describe this. Now, clearly the Biden team does not want to adopt an approach of strategic clarity in which they would specifically say exactly what they would do in response to a Chinese threat against Taiwan. So they're trying to maintain an ambiguous approach. And I think this is going to be one of the challenges. I think the related challenge where we're going to see a lot of questions asked is, there are two ways to read the Ukraine crisis. One is that this has been a tremendous failure by Russia, and that it should remind China that invasions are difficult, that the United States and Europe and its key partners in Asia can put on tremendous economic sanctions. And therefore, it would be very foolish for China to go ahead and attempt an invasion or some other military action against Taiwan. The other reading, of course, is that the US threatened economic sanctions, very severe economic sanctions. It threatened diplomatic responses. It threatened to arm Ukraine. And none of this deterred Russia, right? And so in that sense, you might say, well, sure, you can threaten all these harms, but at the end of the day, China might still go ahead. And I think this is where the Biden team finds itself in a bit of a difficult position. The new defense strategy, which you mentioned earlier, Yuki, is just being released, but the core of it is this concept of integrated deterrence. And integrated deterrence is still a little bit murky, but I think the best way to describe it is it's a belief that the United States can use other tools to deter, not just military tools, right? That it can use allies and partners, that it can use the threat of escalation to different levels of the escalation spectrum, and also the threat of escalating in other domains to deter action that the US military might previously have deterred. The problem with this, of course, is that when it comes to Taiwan, I don't really think that applies, right? I think if Beijing makes a decision that it wants to go ahead and take Taiwan, economic responses are probably not going to be sufficient to deter that. The US and Japan potentially would have to respond with military force. And I think here we would have to demonstrate the capability to probably sink a large portion of an invasion fleet. That means that actually what we need isn't so much integrated deterrence, it's direct defense in the Taiwan Strait, right? It is sea mines, it is anti-ship cruise missiles, it's air defense systems, all those kinds of systems that frankly, some of which we're seeing used by Ukraine very effectively right now. So I think where the Biden team finds itself is in a little bit of a tricky spot. It doesn't want strategic clarity, which means people are going to continue to draw these lines between Taiwan and Ukraine. And it has talked about integrated deterrence more frequently in the last few weeks, but it's not really clear that that applies in a Taiwan Strait contingency. And so I think the question you asked, Yuki, how is Taiwan going to be any different from Ukraine, is actually quite a difficult one for this administration to handle.
Thank you, Zach. And that is really the conundrum that I think we're going to be gnawing on for quite some time, even after this current crisis is over. I really think this is a perfect storm question. Hopping on, focusing on the Japan's NATO relations a little bit. There will be a building on to what Japan has done with Europe on this particular crisis. Moving forward, this is probably more Celine question. Do you think that there will be a more progress in the Japan-NATO cooperation in the international security field? And what kind of, if so, what kind of a role that Japan's self-defense force play in this dynamics? So first to you, Celine, and then I will invite comments from others.
Yes, thank you. I maybe start by following up on your previous questions on Taiwan, because in Europe there have been some discussions too about can we compare the situation between Ukraine and Taiwan? So most of the time we're very reluctant to compare because we say, well, it's another part of the world, it's completely different issues and so on. But obviously there have been a summit between the EU and China last Friday, and the EU was determined to try to prevent China to support Russia, or to make sure that China gets the message that if it wants to support China materially, Russia materially, through more trade or something like that, it will have to pay a price. The EU reminded China that there is up to 15% of Chinese exports that are going to the EU market, compared to only 2% of the Chinese export to the Russian market. So I think that's really kind of mentality, a way that the EU is going to play its game right now. It knows that its big asset is its economic market. So what we have to do is to make sure that that China gets that we have some red lines regarding what China can do vis-a-vis Russia, what China can do vis-a-vis Taiwan too. If you look at the previous, the recent months, and also the last September's Indo-Pacific strategy of the EU, Taiwan is mentioned as a partner of the EU. There is the strong recognition that Taiwan is very important, is crucial for European security. At least if you look at in terms of semiconductor and so on, that's actually very important. There is still an ongoing crisis between Lithuania and China, because Lithuania decided to open a diplomatic missions for Taiwan on its territory, with very strong, Chinese sanctions vis-à-vis Lithuania following. So there is now, a strong acknowledgement of how China is playing so its game vis-à-vis Russia. We do not buy the seemingly, ambiguity posture of Beijing in this Ukraine war. We see clearly that China is actually backing Russia, so that's a big issue. And now for the NATO Japan relations, I think that the cooperation is going also to expand. There have been some discussion in the past months too. There will be a new strategic concept that will be adopted in June, in which the international partnership, strategic partnership of NATO is playing a strong part. At the end of March, Mr. Kishida met with NATO Secretary General in Brussels, and we assert again this willingness to cooperate more. So that's not my role right now to tell you what kind exactly of role Japan will play, or what kind of role the self-defense forces are going to play with NATO. But we can think about tabletop exercises, cooperation on cybersecurity for sure. Maybe disinformation also would be very important. Information sharing, of course. And as you know, NATO has several centers of excellence. So maybe there have been some talks about maybe opening one in the Indo-Pacific region. So maybe NATO could open this kind of center of excellence in the Indo-Pacific region, maybe in Japan, maybe in partnership with Japan on a topic of mutual shared concern.
Thank you, Celine. Kuni, before going back to you, let me add a couple of questions. Let me add one question building on this Japan-NATO relationship. So should we see Japan's support for European efforts to this current crisis as more of a complementary to increasing European activities in Asia? Or do you see this rather as a more of a new trend emerging in connecting European and Asian security more? You've always actually talked about Europe and Asia, or Eurasia is like one big theater, and there's no, in this new era, there is no this artificial divisions. But how do you see this?
Well, I said the Middle East and East Asia are one theater of operation, but not European theater yet. But you're right. I think we've been successful, and I'm sure that European countries are becoming more and more aware of the connection between Russia and China. And therefore, we have to continue reminding the European friends that European security also depends on not only deterring how to deter Russia, but also how to deter China. China is an indispensable part of the potential sort of problem for the security of Europe. That's something we have to keep in mind. And back to the Taiwan issue, I have nothing to add, but I have, as I told you, I have 5 lessons learned from Ukraine, but I found the 6th one. The 6th one is we actually failed to deter, failed to convince the Russians under Putin. We failed to let Putin think strategically. If he had thought strategically, he could have avoided that. But unfortunately, he went to war. Why? because for him, probably the political ideology is more important than his strategic calculation. So the sixth lesson I am learning now is that we should let our adversary or whoever to think strategically and not put more emphasis on the political ideology. China may do it. So in order to do that, we have to continue talking to them, convincing them that they have to think strategically, not ideologically, as Mr. Putin did. And look what happened to Mr. Putin and his Russia. This is something we should keep in mind with respect to the crisis, potential crisis in Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you, Kuni. Kind of building on this, continuing along this theme. Since this Ukraine crisis started, former Prime Minister Abe has started to really talk openly about how Japan should consider nuclear sharing, or at least start the discussion of nuclear sharing. Is this kind of based on his calculation that maybe he launches this really ambitious and very controversial agenda, but then that's really driven by his desire to have more realistic conversation about what the future of Japan's defense capability should include, and really like allowing enemy strike capabilities and other issues that we've been reading in the media? Or is it really shooting for something more, by being overly ambitious, discussion will come down, but still come to much more realistic place that Japan needs to go.
Well, Yuki, you have to talk to Abe-san. I don't know. But
oh, he's thinking more than anyone I know. That's why.
It's a delicate issue, to be honest with you, because I believe that Mr. Abe honestly, seriously believes that nuclear sharing is one of the topics we should discuss. We should have started discussing long time ago, because this is discussion anyway. But we don't have that discussion yet. But what he said is, while what he said is reasonable, the person he encouraged to think about it is Mr. Kishida, who was born in Hiroshima. So I don't think it's going to happen. Given his personal belief and given the current political atmosphere. So, but it's better than nothing. It's worth proposing that we should discuss that issue. I agree with him, but probably this debate will not continue in the foreseeable future, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Thanks for that. That's interesting to know, and for those of us to take note of too, because as we know,
me, please.
this is a public webinar, and but then also I think
public.
it is good for us to keep in mind, because as we know, Japan is revising its own national security strategy and then also defense program guidelines and a midterm defense program. So it will be those in those documents that how these discussions will materialize. So given that, Zach, actually, there's a quick intervention / clarification questions coming from one of the audience. You mentioned about, in your opening remarks, you talked about Taiwan security is directly interlinked with the security of the US and Japan. So if you can just flush it out for those of us, for those of the audience who are not into that wire of US-Japan alliance spam, what did you mean by directly interlinked?
Yeah,
to
sure.
me, it sounds obvious, but maybe not for those who look at, not to those of us who look at this on every day, like you and I do.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think, look, the reality is that, is it possible to defend Japan if Taiwan was in Chinese hands? Maybe, right? But I think we would be having some very direct conversations, as Kuni was just saying, about nuclear sharing arrangements in that case. Right? Think about whether you could physically defend Ishigaki, Yonaguni, Miyako Islands from invasion in that case. I mean, it would be hard. right? I'm not saying it would be impossible, but you would probably be thinking much more about escalation options that could include nuclear escalation, right? And you'd be having much more direct conversations about nuclear sharing arrangements and those sorts of things. I'm not saying that that is what we should be doing now. I do think it's sort of interesting to note that our allies in Korea and Australia and Japan are all wanting to have more discussions about nuclear, not necessarily suggesting that they're going to have nuclear sharing arrangements, and certainly not that they would procure their own nuclear weapons. But I think it demonstrates that there is a general concern that deterrence is weakening to some degree, right? And I think for Japan, if Taiwan were held by mainland China, it would provide a bit of a jumping off point for Japan's southwestern islands, and it would make them harder to defend. Now, I am not saying what I think some people have interpreted the Biden administration as having suggested once or twice, which is that the US can never allow Taiwan to merge with the mainland. Look, my view is that that's a decision for the people on Taiwan to make. I find it unlikely that they will make that decision, having seen what happened a few years ago with Hong Kong, but that's not a decision for the United States to make. That's a decision for Taiwanese to make, in my view. So I'm not prejudging that question. And if Taiwan and China were to come to some sort of peaceful arrangement in which they unified, in my view, the United States should support that decision. But I find it, as I said, highly unlikely that that will happen, and certainly that it would not happen without a tremendous amount of pressure from Beijing. And so I think we have to acknowledge the reality from the US-Japan alliance standpoint that first, that's very unlikely. And therefore, we have to think about what would happen if Taiwan were taken through force and what that would mean for the US-Japan alliance. And I think the bottom line is it would mean that defending the Southwestern Islands would be incredibly difficult. And the discussions that Prime Minister Abe has been suggesting we should be having, those would be very much at the forefront.
May I jump in? Just
Yeah,
30
of course,
seconds.
because some people, actually, there are very much a couple of related questions on this, like Japan and its nuke/nuke sharing discussion.
Taiwan,
so
if Taiwan is invaded, see, they have to surround the island. So if they surround the island, our Yonagunijima Island is only 110 kilometers away from the mainland Taiwan. So that means we'll be involved. And if they really want to conquer that island, they have to attack the US forces, bases in my country. And that's a direct attack against my country. So that's why those two are deeply, deeply connected with each other.
And then that's, I think this is I guess that is another reason why increasingly more political leaders and thought leaders in Japan, I think we're hearing more from them about how Taiwan security is Japan's own national security issue. It directly impacts on it. So obviously this Prime Minister Abe is excellent about provoking these discussions. So his suggestion of nuclear sharing, or at least Japan should consider, really stirred up a lot of people's minds. So, and it really is also about the efficacy or effectiveness of U.S. Extended deterrence, and how Japan does or does not feel confident in the height of what happened in Ukraine, especially with Putin even alluded to his possible use of nuclear weapons vis-a-vis non-nuclear state, which kind of promptly shuts down by NATO, reminding him that, I'm sorry, you are not the only one who has nukes over here. But in light of what's been going on in Europe, is Japan 100% confident that America providing extended deterrent is enough to tackle the nuclear threat in East Asia? Especially now that North Korea is upping its missile test again, just about every other week. I think I should go. I should probably put you, Kuni, on the spotlight and have how about Zach and Celine join you? And we're at the end of the hour already, so this will be the last round.
Well, no nuclear, extended nuclear sort of extended deterrence. No extended deterrence is perfect. Okay. And we should continue keeping trying to keep the option alive always. That's something we can do. And nuclear sharing is a solution in Europe. And it's something we could keep in mind as one of the options in the future. But as I told you before, given the current political atmosphere in my country, and our upper house election is coming this summer, I don't think that we will have a serious debate on that in the foreseeable future. Maybe after the great victory of the LDP in the summer upper house election, there might be a chance, but you never know.
Zach, anything to add? Wrap up your thought?
I'll just add, I think, if you step back and you ask, are we going to have discussions about nuclear arrangements in more detail in Asia? I think the answer is yes. Maybe not this year, but over the next decade. Look, we now have a Northeast Asia region with a very belligerent Russia, which has lots of nuclear weapons, a increasingly assertive China, which is building lots of nuclear weapons, and North Korea, which is also firing off missiles left and right, and again, building lots of nuclear warheads. So I think it would be difficult to imagine 10 years from now, if those three trends continue, that our core allies, Japan and Korea and Northeast Asia, wouldn't be asking the United States for a lot more clarity about exactly how extended deterrence works, and asking whether they wanted to bolster the extended deterrence commitment in some way, whether that's nuclear sharing or more publicity around strategic deterrence operations. I don't know. But I think that in the long term, this is going to be a conversation that we're going to have. And I hope that we can have it in a way that it doesn't engender more competition between our key allies in the region, but actually potentially can sort of maybe even bring them together, right? Like I would love to be able to, as an American, have some Japan, Korea, US conversations about extended deterrence and what it would take to reinforce extended deterrence over the next decade or so. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Celine, any final thoughts?
Yeah, maybe just to add on the extended deterrence credibility, I think it's really a question of perceptions and trust. So it's difficult to say, well, we are 100% sure that, nothing will happen because if we are under attack, the US will deploy the nukes. It doesn't work like that. I understand. So yeah, all about trust. So we will see in the coming months also with the new national security strategy. Japan is going to adopt a new defense guidelines also. So maybe that will provide occasion for opportunities for more in-depth discussion with the US on this and others. I understand that also one factor that played to encourage Japan to take a very proactive stance this time vis-a-vis Russia is actually some kind of US, whispering, or maybe some kind of US talk or pressure on Tokyo. So that's yeah, very complicated game. I believe that the Biden administration is really putting its partnership and allies and alliance at the core center of its foreign policy and strategy vis-a-vis China. So we have to keep all that in mind for the future, I guess.
Thank you. And that we're right at 4 minutes after the end of the 10:04. So This was fascinating discussion. I'm really glad that this Japan, US, European conversation was able to take place. I very much thank everyone, all the panelists to join in and share with us your thoughts, which are all insightful. I always learn a lot from each of you whenever I have you on the conversation. So thank you so much for joining me. And thank you for those of you who joined in from Asia so late. Europe, I think it's in the mid-afternoon, but thank you. I see several European sounding names on the Q&A, so I'm sure you get the Celine's presence really helped to boost up the European representation on this panel. And Zach, it's great to have you always. So thank you everyone for joining the seminar, and this concludes this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.